Welcome to the Doubts Aloud podcast. We are three agnostic/atheist voices based in the UK, or from across the pond for any listeners in the US. We have an avid interest in discussing religion and theism with a strong emphasis on Christianity. We seek to elucidate, reflect and critique in a respectful manner such issues to do with apologetics, doctrines, science, faith, archaeology and biblical studies. We also will have interviews of some very interesting people from both religious and secular points of view.
I'm really excited about this. We have an interview with John Nelson, who spoke at the London discussion group, just coming up. Now, John, I'm really rate. I think he's a tremendous person, and he did a brilliant talk. And after that, he sat down with Andrew, and Andrew gave him an interview.
Okay then, welcome John. Oh, can I just say, when Ed said that we're going to have John on, I had this sort of fantasy idea that it was the Apostle John. And I had this sort of, wow, wouldn't that be a great thing? I would get the Apostle John on and say, now, did you really write Revelation and the Epistles? Matter of fact, did you even write the Gospel of John? And then
yeah. I could go along with, well, of course I wrote the Gospel of John. I mean, can't you see all the undesigned coincidences in the text? You know,
there you go.
Have you not picked up on the details which are so neatly corroborating the synoptic Gospels?
I would then say, how do you feel about someone sticking in the woman caught in adultery story right in the middle of your text?
Yeah. Brilliant.
Okay, well, we haven't got the Apostle John on. That would be another kind of podcast, wouldn't it? So we've heard all about you, John, so let's just kick right into the subject. You were recently invited to speak at the Unbelievable Skeptics in the Pub, held monthly and hosted by myself and Ed. And we're here today on Doubts Aloud to sort of probe you a little bit about that talk. So would you just like to sort of set the scene on what you spoke about?
Yeah, so I was talking about these criteria of authenticity, which have frequently been employed by scholars. Really, I mean, they've always been sort of lying in the background of a lot of Enlightenment-based scholarship, but they've come to the fore, particularly in the past 50, 60 years. But what I find very interesting is that these have been used in historical Christian apologetics, but actually the field of historical Jesus studies has kind of moved on from them. So I was talking about some of their criticisms, why they're needed, and this sort of thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was there, saw it in the flesh, and I thought it was an amazing talk. I think it's like there's been two talks in the entire 2 years we've been doing this, where I've completely... it's been in areas where I've done the similar kind of research, or at least touched into the area in depth. One of and this was one of them. And I thought straight away, this guy is on the cutting edge of at least what people are saying. It doesn't even have to be, what do you think? It's what people are saying. And I thought, yeah, that's what I've read. Dale Allison, as you'll mention, comes up a lot. So yeah, so what was the first thing? I think the first thing was this criteria, or you were talking about the criteria and then you were calling them into question. Yeah, can you explain a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so there are a number of sort of commonly recognised problems with the criteria of authenticity. Do you want me to talk a bit about why we need criteria of authenticity to kick us off?
Yeah, if you just
as a sort of set up for that. So historians, really since the Enlightenment, have based all their critical studies of history upon certain what we'd call historiographical principles. So historiography is the reconstructing of history. And these principles are things like it's good to have early source material. It's good to have lots of source material, which is ideally independent. And also, we need material which seems to go against the grain of the author's own biases. So material which is potentially embarrassing or distinct from the author's own beliefs. And in the study of the New Testament, these sort of principles have been developed into what we call criteria of authenticity. And so they're aiming to solve a number of problems that the gospel texts raise. So, for instance, one problem would be that nearly all the attestation we have to Jesus as a historical figure is Christian attestation. So these people were intimately connected, intimately involved in the person of Jesus, and they were viewing his life from the perspective of his death, his resurrection, and the whole Christ event. Then you've got like the problem of distance.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say. So you're saying then that that's a legitimate historical concern if your only major sources are in fact people that are involved in that way.
Yeah, and so it would be for any historical text. You would kind of want to have both sides of the story, and it's unfortunate that we only really do have one side of the story in the case of the Gospels. But another problem would be, for instance, distance. So the earliest Gospel, Mark, generally recognised to have been written maybe 65 to 70 AD, which places it, roughly 40 years after the events themselves. And then you've got problems with possible contradictions in the Gospels. Or if not contradictions, you at least have different portraits of Jesus. So Mark's Jesus is not the same as Matthew's Jesus, who is not the same as John's Jesus. And so the criteria of authenticity are almost brought in to arbitrate between some of these sort of key issues and sort of decide, okay, which stuff actually does reflect Jesus as Jesus.
That's a very good point. And when I was at college, I first sort of stumbled on this concept of at Bible college, that is, the concept of John's description of Jesus, for example, talking about if we had to cross-examine whoever wrote the Gospel of John, it would be the portrayals of his long sort of ethereal, almost very spiritual speeches, which really sound nothing like the pithy statements that's said in Mark. And I kind of, when I read it like that, I thought, gosh, you've got two different characters going on here, walking around at the same time, if it was like a video on them. So what's going on? Is that the sort of thing you mean in terms of the differences? Yes. And how that might... How does that reach back and actually access the historical Jesus when we've got these different portraits? Okay, then. So can you just sum up an example of a criteria and then a criticism of it?
Yeah. So perhaps the sort of foremost or most important, frequently discussed criterion is known as the criterion of dissimilarity or difference. And this also encompasses the criterion of embarrassment as a subset of it. And it essentially states that we get back to the authentic Jesus when we can isolate material in the Gospels which is not the product of their Christian or Jewish milieu. So on the surface of things, this makes a lot of sense, given those principles of historiography we were talking about. Because it says, well, if we want Jesus as Jesus, why don't we just isolate those things which don't seem to derive from his Jewish context, don't seem to... derive from his Christian context either. And then the related criterion to this would be the criterion of embarrassment. So things that look embarrassing in the tradition, things which would have been embarrassing to early Christians, are more likely to be historical because they've sort of retained those things, even though they go against their interests. So, for instance, John's baptism by Jesus seems to subordinate Jesus to John, perhaps, and may even imply, that Jesus is somehow in need of John's baptism.
Yeah, a sinner, baptism for repentance.
Yeah, so therefore it's likely that it happened. Or, for instance, Jesus' childhood in Nazareth seems to be authentic, because Nazareth was a backwater Galilean town. It's never mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, in the pseudepigrapha, in the rabbinic literature. I don't think it's mentioned till very late on. And so we only really know about it from archaeology and from the New Testament. And if there was a belief that the Messiah should descend from Bethlehem, then the datum that Jesus grew up in Nazareth could present a problem. And so therefore likely reflects sort of historical fact. And then the big one, of course, is the crucifixion, which is just so obviously embarrassing and so obviously sort of scarred the Christian movement, that no one thinks that crucifixion was a noble death to die in the ancient world. Deuteronomy, I think it's Deuteronomy 21, talks about cursed is the person who hangs on the tree. So it's very unlikely that Christians would make this stuff up or build a religion around it.
Although I have, funnily enough, on that point, I have read from Candida Moss, I think it is, in her book Myth of Martyrdom, that Luke, in fact, is written more to the perspective of the crucifixion as more of a noble death, and removing that Mark's portrayal. And again, it goes back to these different portrayals if you let them speak for themselves. I don't know if you've heard of that or not, about how Luke, he's a lot more in control and in Luke, whereas Mark he's not. And so
and also in John he's in control, so he carries his own cross, and so there's these prophecies. But the question then is, is this sort of is this post-fact explanation? Okay, is this trying to make something which really wasn't very good on the ground, to people who knew that Jesus had been killed? We see, as N.T. Wright points out, other messianic movements, which when the messianic figure is killed, the whole movement dissipates. I think that the crucifixion would have been a massive, as Paul says, stumbling block to both Jews and to pagans as well, which is why many people probably didn't accept Christianity. And we have, for instance, graffiti from the 2nd century, I think, which says, your God dies on a tree. This doesn't make any sense. It's foolishness. So I think overall we can say that something like the crucifixion, obviously it's multiply attested as well. It sort of permeates the New Testament texts, but it is embarrassing as well, certainly.
Yeah. Okay. So that's very interesting then, to see the. So that's the criteria of embarrassment, and you're saying that can be criticised as well.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah.
Because I mean, so to give a sort of criticism to the criterion of embarrassment, something may seem embarrassing to our modern perspective, which may not have been embarrassing to an ancient perspective. And sometimes embarrassing material does actually make for a good narrative, as you sort of said, a sort of dramatic story. Obviously, then we have to go into the question of genre, and were these just made up stories or not? So just because something is embarrassing doesn't mean it's historical. But then, so the embarrassment is a subset of a wider criterion called dissimilarity. And again, this suffers from similar problems because it assumes that we know enough about Second Temple Judaism and about Christianity to be able to isolate Jesus from both. But given our lack of knowledge of both Judaism and Christianity, this doesn't seem to be a very reasonable assumption.
Right. Actually, that leads me on to another point to do with this, because I've noticed in the skeptical sort of those of faith, those of not, but are looking at it historically, one thing I've definitely noticed in the we don't know bracket, so to speak, in the gap of there's a big hole here of knowledge. We don't know. There isn't much writing left or whatever. I've noticed that those of faith say, we've got a good. Well, we just have a deep inside reason that it's all pretty much straightforward, and this probably happened. And the skeptical people will say, and this is why it likely is all made up. So we're both looking at the gap of lack of knowledge, which all would admit, and then they say in that then it's highly likely that things were made up, whereas those of faith would say, well, it's highly likely that we've got an established principle, but both don't actually know. So what would you say the difference between a Christian of your standing and looking back and the fundamentalist who just says, well, look, we know what happened, we just read the New Testament and that's all you need? That's the fundamentalist kind of approach, I'd say. I know people who would say that. Well, of course, what is all these years of 200 years studying about the historical Jesus? We know what he did, we read the word of God. What would you say to that approach?
Yeah, I mean, it's a historically illiterate approach. I mean, you can have my 13-year-old.
You heard it here, folks.
My 13-year-old self would have said, Mark's gospel is inerrant without having read Mark's gospel.
Yes,
and
theology.
Yeah, and that is
theology first.
That is very, very dangerous, it's also, I think, very deeply unchristian as well. It's not meek, it's not humble, it's not trying to learn something. And I found that, in my sort of studies of Jesus, I've learned as much, if not more, from atheist scholars who are, just approaching it from a historical perspective as Christian scholars. But yeah, I mean, there are lots and lots of deep problems with that sort of fundamentalist attitude to Scripture. I mean, kingdom of God. What does that mean? What does that mean? Okay,
exactly.
As soon as you attempt to answer any of these very basic questions, you are doing history.
Son of Man.
Yeah. Massive question about the Son of Man.
There's a library of books just on each subject that you could put together in the world, and yet the person who reads the Son of Man, that's this, from a sort of a simple approach. So it can't be like that historically. So what would you say then what's the overarching state of Jesus research now, in the sense that do you think that historical Christian scholars of faith, that they are saying, okay, we can all agree that there's these principles, but when it comes to the supernatural Son of God side, that's a matter of faith? Or do you think that there are some scholars that think that others are really denying history, if you see what I mean? The resurrection is the most obvious thing with the evidence, and now you're just got biases to deny it? Or do you think that actually we can't go that far?
It's a very, very difficult question, whether the question of Jesus' resurrection is a historical question at all. Right. Surely we can say some historical things about it, but whether we can sort of muster from this sort of evidentialist perspective a case for the resurrection, so much so that I can say to you, Andy, you must, to be a rational person, believe in the resurrection. The thing is, so Mike Licona did his PhD on the resurrection, which I recently read, and it's very fascinating how he assesses the different options, the different explanations, and he finds them wanting. Okay, yes. But he says, I think that the second most persuasive option is just to say agnosticism. Again, it's this black hole in first century history. We just don't know. Yeah. So it's you've either got the resurrection or you've got we just don't know. Yeah. Yeah. It's those two things. It's those two options really.
And that, because rather than saying that you're like a climate change denier or something, and that, it's that black hole again, and you can go both ways. It's the same with the reliability of the Bible. Oh, well, we've got this big gap before we really start knowing the different textual differences, and so that means it was completely reliable until then. And then the skeptic says, well, that's why it was probably hopeless before then.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big issues with this gap is that, the gap is more of a problem if you do not think that the Gospels are based on eyewitness sources. So if they are based on eyewitness sources, yes, you've got the problems of eyewitness testimony, but there are certain circumstances, some scholars would argue, where eyewitness testimony can be reliable. We do trust on our memories for sort of ordinary day life, but also we can, go into our 80s and remember certain distinct events that we've recited. And so Borkham would argue, for instance, that the gospel events are those type of distinct, life-changing events, and that they have been recited over long periods of time. The black hole is more of a problem if you don't think that the Gospels are based on eyewitnesses.
Yes. And then you have to throw in, like I mentioned about the the Gospel of John, say, story that's well accepted that it wasn't in the original Gospel, about the woman caught in adultery, which is such a classic Christian scene that actually in the end we then got the issue of, okay, so is that a floating story that someone else said and thought, well, that sounds just like Jesus, let's put it in there. It raises all kinds of questions about this black hole period, even though, about what may have been said about Jesus. Even Papias, the famous guy that's referred to a lot, mentioned stuff about Jesus and that Jesus said, and that eyewitnesses said that Jesus said, that isn't in our Bible, and it's amazing. And
the Gospel of Thomas as well. Yes, which people would date very, very early sometimes. I think too early. Yeah. But I think most people would date it, some point in the 2nd century. But it does contain, unique sayings of Jesus, and that's something that's characterised really the third quest for the historical Jesus, is this openness to other sources, outside of the canonical texts. What you find is, though, with the Jesus Seminar, for example, is that they verified almost nothing outside of the canonical texts. The Gospels are the best texts we have for building a portrait of the life of Jesus.
Yeah, but the one thing that I get from that, because I know some people do date it quite early, even to the 1st century, but I think most don't. But the continuation that I see very similar to Johannine language, and this particularly in my area of studies, which is the eschatology, that actually it's fascinating that you get apocalypticism in Mark, Matthew and Luke, the synoptics, and then you get this sort of almost a removal of it in a lot of ways from John, and then you get a direct a claim against apocalypticism in Thomas. It's like, wow, to me it's like a trajectory of which would put sort of Thomas, to me, in terms of the way things developed, possibly in the early 2nd century, because of the way early to mid maybe. And so many minds can take a lot of these evidences that we have in different ways, and this is, I suppose, the complex thing.
And also, I mean, the agendas come to play as well.
Yes.
So we can't pretend that when we approach these questions that we are disinterested, personally or removed from them. I mean, Jesus is almost like an archetype for the good, and we want to paint him as rulers have through the centuries in lots and lots of different ways, as on board with our agenda. So, for instance, is it surprising that the Jesus Seminar, for instance, used this non-apocalyptic Gospel of Thomas when these scholars are all reacting against an apocalyptic sort of mindset in fundamentalist American Christianity? Is that surprising?
Yes.
Or is it surprising that, that a conservative scholar will come out affirming more history than not? And so I think this is where the criteria of authenticity are quite important, is that they're trying to build a consensus. They're trying to build a critical minimum of what we can say about the sources, no matter how much we agree on, were they the products of eyewitnesses and these other specific questions. Okay, we can apply the criteria nonetheless and see what we come out with.
Right. The other question is really now sort of taking a sidetrack, because in the session that you did for the Unbelievable Skeptics in the Pub, I was actually there bringing up this very question, so I can do it again now in the interview. The contrast between the evidence historically that you could probably say, okay, these are the criteria and we're getting somewhere. Now here's the critique of the criteria. Now we're not getting somewhere. And so we jumble it all together and we still say, right, there's some things there that are likely to be historical. Fair enough. But I brought up the other side of the coin, like, for example, the ascension in Luke, where Jesus is described as in Bethany before 12 people, or for the disciples, ascending up behind a cloud. 2 angels or 2 men in white appear and say he'll come back in the same way. It's only narrated like that in one place. It's not even in Matthew. It's either assumed in Matthew or just not said. It's not in Mark, but it's in the author of Luke and Acts. So when it comes to that, I noticed that you sort of switched gears and said, well, I will accept that, but that's on creedal basis. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, so there are certain creeds that we recite or we sing every Sunday. So I've been singing the sort of Apostles' Creed, ascended into heaven. And that's one of the things that we join with all Christians, all Christians who can be considered orthodox throughout history, in affirming. So, I mean, probably my answer is going to differ slightly from in the group, but whether that commits me to the view that there was a particular appearance where this sort of thing happened, I'm not sure necessarily whether that does commit me to the view. I think any Christian would say that Jesus ascended to the right hand of the Father, and they might not necessarily have some sort of pictorial image of that.
Yeah, what does that mean even?
Or belief. Yeah, it is religious language, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's the language of myth.
And would you see probably no different in that Catholic orthodoxy celebrates the assumption, in some sense, of Mary into heaven, or the body of Mary. I'm not quite sure the specifics about that, but it's like outside of Protestant understanding and belief and acceptance. But nevertheless, from their point of view, they haven't even got a Bible passage to support that, but they do have a historical understanding of why it's real. So would you be in the same camp at that level? So it's not really historical, it's really faith.
Well, the ascension is so closely tied to the resurrection. You've got to ask yourself the question: what does it mean for the resurrection to be historical? Because this body is eating fish and also walking through walls.
Yes.
And so it becomes so complex.
Yes.
This seems to be a new thing happening.
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult for me to actually tell what's going on, and whether I can describe this as historical in any sense analogous to I would describe me having coffee for breakfast as
yes,
historical.
I know, yeah. That's interesting, isn't it? Very interesting. Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been great having the Apostle John... sorry. to interview about what really happened. No, John, it's been great having you on the show. And you are, in fact, our first interviewee. So... as this goes across the world and is picked up, hopefully you will be the first interviewee on the Doubts Aloud podcast. So thank you very much for being on.
Thanks very much.
Well, that was such a great time interviewing John. He was our first guest on the Doubts Aloud podcast, and we talked off air as well, and we must have him back on. It was a really, really good interview.
Yeah, it was excellent.
Yeah, he's just a tremendous person. I so rate him, and that was fascinating stuff. Thanks a lot, Andrew. You did really well. This month we're going to jump straight into our segment, Reason and God. Now, with Reason and God, we're looking at arguments for and against God, and particularly we're using this book, and which has 50 arguments for God listed in it. And I've decided to randomise the chapters because otherwise we'd be doing ID and design for about a year solid. And so what's come up from my randomiser is we're going to do chapter 6 of the 50 first off, called Responding to the Argument from Evil, 3 Approaches for the Theist. Now, all the book details you'll get in the show notes. But, Francis, what did you make of this chapter?
Well, I think that this approach, which is called sceptical theism, is a difficult one for the theist to maintain. Because I would say that you pull that thread of scepticism and everything starts to unravel. It's then very hard to draw a line as to where you can start to have some knowledge. I guess I should go into what sceptical theism is for people who haven't read the chapter. And briefly, sceptical theism responds to the problem of evil by saying, well, we can't expect to know the mind of God, and God may have good reasons for what appears to us to be pointless suffering. But from our limited perspective, how can we tell that it's pointless? So it's really a response which says that we are ignorant and we have to accept our ignorance.
That's a good clarification, Francis, because sceptical theism, particularly if someone stumbles across this podcast where we are sceptical of theism,
Yes.
is nothing like that in this particular apologetic that you're talking about, is it?
No, that's right. You would think when you saw the word skeptic that you were going to see something quite challenging of apologetics, but sceptical theism is a tool of apologetics to respond to the argument from the existence of evil, which we say makes it highly unlikely that the God of the Christian God, the all-loving, all-powerful God, that such a God would exist and would create the world we see around us.
Another tool in the arsenal for the lawyers for Christ. Yes.
Indeed.
Yeah, when atheists are being cynical, they say, oh, it's pulling the mystery card. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something
Yes.
I thought was actually quite clever in the chapter that I think we really should be considering responding to is he said, well, okay, so this is it's an appeal to ignorance. When we say we don't know why God should allow suffering, therefore no God, it sounds like a kind of argument for an ignorance, which is a sort of well-known fallacy. And and he says that. Well, what do you make of that, Francis? Before I jump in.
Well, I thought that was not quite on the point, because I think the argument from ignorance is where, rather than admitting ignorance, somebody tries to give an answer without actually having any evidence that is the answer, but just saying, well, here is an answer, and if this answer were right, that would explain things, therefore you should accept that answer. And I think that my take on this was that if anybody is using an argument from ignorance, it's the sceptical theist who is coming up saying, well, we're not quite sure why this apparently pointless suffering exists, but let's speculate that there is an answer, which is that God knows what he's doing. So I see it as rather more that they are trying to put into an area where they are ignorant any answer. And so I think the boot's rather on the other foot. That's how I see it. But you may see it differently. You may think there's more to it than that.
No, I was just going to say, it's funny that apologists or Christians or preachers, they spend an awful lot of time saying, come and know Jesus, come and know God, come into a relationship where you can know each other, using the language of know and relating. And suddenly you turn around and say, oh, actually, we can't really know aspects of God over here because, well, it turns out they're helping them in another way.
Yeah.
Yes.
I love to put...
It's all...
I love to put everything in this framework that we talked about last week of it being in court and seeing what is the most unlikely of the options. So you've got this hypothesis that there's this good, all-powerful, loving God behind everything. And under that hypothesis, we see it's extremely unlikely that we would have the kind of suffering that we see, the level of suffering, its randomness, the way it targets children, all that sort of thing. And when you have an unlikelihood that the Christians claim the naturalist position has, say, he mentions in the chapter that we don't know how life started on Earth, and that's sort of an ignorance that we're appealing to, according to him. Well, I would say, under that, this sort of likelihood framework, it's not particularly unlikely that something happening 3.5 billion years ago that only 100 years or 150 years into Darwinism, that we still don't understand fully what happened, and we've only got plausible theories. So that level of lack of knowledge isn't really reflected in an unlikelihood, which it does with the suffering issue.
Ed, sorry, I have to say there, but have you noticed that, of course, they do know the answer of what happened back then? So when it comes to that subject, they preach it from the pulpit. God did it, whether it was 6,000 years or 3 billion years, they know what happened. It's only the atheists or the scientists that don't know. So in that area of apologetics, where we or the skeptic people or humanists or whatever don't know something, they jump on with assured knowledge. But in this area that you're talking about, they will then hide under the same umbrella of I don't know. And you need to accept that, they say.
Yeah.
Before
we move on, I think we should acknowledge that this idea is in the Bible as well. It's not just like an apologist wheeze. I suppose the best place, I guess, is the end of Job, where Job, after all his suffering, meets God demanding an explanation, and God just says, where were you when I created the world, when I laid out the heavens, all that kind of thing, and Job is left speechless. Of course, there's sort of my ways are not your ways, declares the Lord, that kind of stuff as well. But moving back to the actual philosophy, we'll link to this. There's this Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a very well established and helpful resource from Stanford University. That has a big long thing on sceptical theism you might want to look up. And in that, it's quite interesting. There's this famous parent analogy, which people with suffering will be used to. So, Francis, do you want to say how that goes?
The parent analogy is that in the same way that a parent might do something to a child that would hurt the child, and the child would not understand why the parent was doing it, but the parent would have good reason and is a loving parent doing their best for their child. So we are like children to God. In fact, we're probably, from the theistic point of view, way below God. So our understanding of what God is doing is extremely limited, and we have to accept that God is doing what's ultimately for the best, even if we can't see it at the time. So like the child grows up and looks back and says, oh yes, now I understand, although at the time I couldn't understand and I thought you were hurting me. Now I see that it was all for the best. I mean, I don't know whether you want to sort of look at some of the issues about that. I mean, I think that one reason I would say that analogy doesn't work is that a parent is a person of limited power, and they have to deal with the world as it is, and they have to use means to an end, and they may have to use means which are objectionable because they're not omnipotent, and so they can only achieve the ends they want by going through certain means, which may include hurting their child. That doesn't apply to God. Why, if God has an end, why can't he move straight to the end? It's something that's a characteristic of limited individuals, limited and non-omnipotent individuals, that they have to employ means to achieve their ends.
Yeah, that's really good.
I see what you're saying, Francis. A bit like somebody like God would have the ability to make a situation so the child would know in that worldview, as opposed to the human one we're in. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's certainly a good point. But I think even more radically than that. I mean, shall we say I want to have a new bathroom put in. Well, that's my end. My means to do that are that I have to get plumbers to come along. There's all disruption in the house. I have to use, I have to use a different bathroom. I can't use the normal bathroom. Probably the heating gets turned off. The water gets turned off. It's all chaos and difficulty. But I've got no other way of doing it. I have to use those means to achieve my end. Whereas if I was omnipotent, I'd just say, new bathroom now. And it will be there.
There's another aspect here that comes out in the Stanford Encyclopedia stuff. So they have this parent analogy, and then they have this reverse parent analogy, which makes, I think it's a different point to what you're making, and that is we'd expect a loving parent with great power to explain to the suffering child the reasons for her suffering. And
yes.
God in his omnipotence surely wouldn't be difficult just to fill us in with a bit of extra knowledge to understand why we are suffering like we are.
Yeah, how about a revelation in a book?
Yeah.
Oh no, that didn't work. That didn't work, did it?
Anyway, I think that the point is that we shouldn't just take it on the chin and say, yes, this is an excellent get-out. There are a lot of to and fro, as given in the encyclopedia entry. But for now, let's just accept it, because of particularly loads of Christians do. They don't call it sceptical theism, but they say yes, it's all mysterious, and I'm sure we'll be told in heaven why it's all like this. And so they accept the kind of mystery. And then we want to say, okay, let's say sceptical theism is true. What actually are its implications? And that's something we really want to hone down on. We've got a few that we've trawled up, and Francis, off you go.
Well, I think that, as I've said, it's a thread that when you pull it, it's very hard to see how you can't cause everything to unravel from that single act of throwing aside what you might think was a common sense approach to life, that things are as they appear to be and are not generally the complete opposite of what they appear to be. So where they're seems to be pointless suffering, we are rational in concluding that suffering is indeed pointless. And one of the things that goes out of the window when you start saying, well, you can never really understand God, is, well, okay, if you can never really understand God, how is it possible for you to be a Christian? Because doesn't being a Christian entail a certain amount of having an understanding of God? But if you have no understanding of God, if he is this creature, not a creature, but he is this being who is so entirely removed from your sphere of understanding, then perhaps you have misinterpreted everything that you think he's told you. Perhaps what you think is good is bad. Perhaps what you think is bad is good. Perhaps when you think that the death and resurrection of Jesus were good things, maybe they're bad things. Maybe from some much more long-reaching point of view, the whole of Christianity will turn out to have been a dreadful thing, but God brought it around to achieve some greater good, perhaps the lucky ultimate beneficiaries of the actual evil of the crucifixion and resurrection will be the inhabitants of the planet Zog in umpteen billion years' time, who will be able to look back and say, "Oh yes, that needed to be done, so that we Zogites could reap the benefit, which was always God's long-term plan." I just feel that this sort of scepticism, it's that way madness lies. You are never going to be certain of anything if you adopt that approach.
I think one thing to sum up there, Francis, on that planet would be their revival meetings would go like this: come down the aisle and come and know the God you can't know. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
There are some specifics I want to sort of get to. One of them is that if you're going to say that that you've no idea what God would do, then you can't really use any of the things we do see in the world as from God. So if you see a beautiful, lovely sunset, and you can't say, well, God, definitely I know God so well that he would do that, so it must be from God. He would just as well give an ugly sunset as a good one. Mm-hmm. We just don't know. So there's nothing in the world that we know would be the sort of thing we'd expect if God was real. So we can't make any positive arguments for God because of that.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
Another thing, William Rowe was the one who kind of made this probabilistic argument for evil that sceptical theism was the philosophical response to. And when he heard it, he came straight back with this point. Well, okay, imagine the world is the most absolutely miserable you could imagine. So it's just misery all the way through from when you're born to when you die. And then we know for some magic reason that we all go to hell afterwards as well and suffer for eternity there afterwards. Can you think of anything to make this even worse, folks?
Perhaps a holiday in Butlins. Yeah.
Okay, so that misery is heaped on top. Even in this world, if you accept sceptical theism, you've still got no evidence that God isn't good.
This is the problem with using the mystery card, as you said, Ed. You know, and yet they don't like like I said before, the scientists saying the big origins of life are a mystery either. So, but they're hiding behind this theological concept of mystery to get out of a tight spot.
Now, Andrew,
that's me.
You're walking in the park.
Oh yeah.
And you see a toddler drowning in a paddling pool.
Right.
What would you do?
Well, the instinctive reaction for me, and I think probably most others who would witness or resonate, as the word goes, would seek to, almost without thinking, based on the fact that it's a toddler for starters, just dive in to rescue that child. Based on the assumption of they can't swim, they're vulnerable, you are capable and powerful enough in that situation to do so.
So you're using your moral judgment of the world as to what would be best for the toddler.
That's right.
Yeah. But you also use those same abilities to work out that when you use those abilities to work out that God isn't good, you know as a theist that you're mistaken. So you aren't very good at working out what's good for the toddler.
Right, I see what you mean. Yes. And
So would you really think it's a good idea to jump in and help the toddler?
Yeah, I would.
I mean, maybe God might have some purpose that you don't know about that's within his great goodness.
Yeah. Well, even in this scenario, even if you could say that you didn't see the full picture, which is where you're sort of heading to, and there's some bigger thing going on, like, for example, that toddler is actually a very young-looking actor who's in the water on a film set, and you've just not seen it, and you've just gone in and rescued. Still, those instincts, I would say, are right, even if you spoiled what was going on in that sense, if you didn't see the bigger picture. So you have a question there of, did you still do the right thing? Or the best thing, or the instinctive thing.
I mean, I think there is a reply on the moral scepticism. I think what the approach you're talking about, Ed, is called the moral scepticism response to theistic scepticism, which is to say, then we can never know what is a good or bad action. We'd be paralysed into inactivity, because if we accept that we can't, that things are so outside our knowledge that we simply can't, when there appears to be pointless suffering, there may be a point to it, and things that appear to us to be evil are actually not evil, we would grind to a halt in all our efforts to do anything about it, because of the possibility that hiding behind the appearance there is some greater good that we may be interfering with. And I think the attempted response to that is that you look for known goods and known bads. So in the case of the toddler drowning, you can't know what unknown goods or bads there are, but you can see something that appears to be a known good. Unknown goods or bads are unknown, so they can't be taken into account. And so in those circumstances, the sceptical theist will say, you don't need to have moral scepticism, you deal with a known good, but or with tackling a known bad. But that does rather undercut the whole basis of the scepticism of theism, because you can only act on known goods or bads if you have some basis for assuming that they are generally reliable. And so you are saying that generally, when we see something that appears to be bad, we know it is bad. It is reasonable to assume it's bad. And yet that is contrary to their whole argument. You can't assume that, you can't say that the toddler drowning is a known bad thing unless you have reason to reject the idea that there's always a bigger picture that you can't understand, and that prevention of people from acting on what is a common sense approach, that things are as they appear and not the opposite of what they appear, I think cannot rationally be countered by the theistic skeptic.
There's another way of approaching this, and that's for people to say, well, we just obey God and that's all that matters. So if God tells you to help people like the toddler in trouble, then you obey his commands.
Or kill the Canaanites. You know what I mean? It's, well, it's the same thing, isn't it?
Yes,
just obeying
right.
God, you know.
Yeah. Well, there's the issue also of does God speak to us truthfully, which is coming up down the line. Okay, the next one is that when you take this line, you actually find out that something like the goodness of God is sort of sucked dry of any meaning. So take, for example, when you're worshipping God, Andrew, when you were a Christian and you were in church worshipping God, what sort of was going through your mind as you were thinking about God and his goodness?
Gosh, that's some time back. What, in relation to his goodness and thinking?
Yeah, what actually content what got put onto that?
Right. Well, I mean, I would have just had the overriding assumption about God in any area that, you know, there was no darkness, no error, no deception. It's just all pure, pristine truth of any kind of thoughts about God. anything that you thought that God was saying to you in devotionally or whatever was true, unless you equally taught that if it was wrong it would be the devil or your flesh, but if it was really God it would be again, that's another issue, isn't it? How would you ever know, but that was the assumptions, and so therefore it's like you have a theology first, you operate, and however you perceive hearing from God, it already comes ready packaged with your theology about it that you understand at the time. So that would. So
my thinking is that when you think of God and all the lovely things He's done, and then you'll say, "Oh, so God is good. What hasn't He done wonderful things?" But we don't know if something is wonderful or not because of we don't know. You don't get the connection between what we see in the world and God's goodness. So there's no way we can know if any particular deed that God's done is good or not, because we say we don't have that moral capability. Capacity because of the mystery.
Yeah. Do you see a tie-in, by the way, Ed, to this whole thing of suffering in evolutionary sense, and say this modern argument with plate tectonics? Well, earthquakes and that happen because you don't see the bigger picture. We now know that we need plate tectonics, and so I can imagine that being used as well in a similar sort of thing about. But well, if only in the past it looked like God was just this, that, and the other, but now we understand about plate tectonics, so we need them to survive on the planet. So earthquakes and tsunamis are actually okay, but we didn't know that, but now we do. This is the answer. Very similar fields of discussion are being operated in different areas of apologetics.
But you'd wonder why God hadn't told us that beforehand. He had to find.
Yes, you could have just said, Yes,
since we can.
Instead of the language, I'm bringing an earthquake.
I think also it goes back to the issue about means and ends as well. You would have thought that God could achieve whatever end He has in mind
without that,
by using a rather less drastic means.
That's right.
Given His unlimited power.
It's making your point. You could actually go straight to the end with God's power. Only human beings can't go straight to the end because we're limited.
And also, if you're praying and you sort of say, "I trust that it will all end well. I trust you, God." There's no content to that because of it could end in any way, and it would still be God's goodness. So if you're praying for your child who's in hospital, it's still in keeping with God's goodness for the child to die. So praying and trusting God.
This is the best of all worlds that God could have ever made, it could be argued.
It does remind me of my spiritualist relatives on my father's side of the family who would get messages from the spirits that somebody who was ill was going to recover. And when they died, they said, they've recovered now. They're up in heaven. So it's all, so the spirits are right. Whatever happened, the spirits are always going to be right. If they'd recovered, they would have been right. They died. They were still right.
That's the classic one, isn't it? Have you not heard that thing where people say, there's no dragons in this room or something, or something like that. He says something says, or something like that. He says, I can't see any dragons. You see what I mean? It worked. It's like, so you've set up a whole imaginary scenario that's happened without any evidence.
Okay, so anyway. There's one last thing. If God can do anything, and it would still be a good action, because there's no way of finding out. Maybe God could be deceiving us in the Bible. What do you think, Francis?
Yes, it's part of that thing. You've pulled the thread. You can't stop it unravelling. You can't stop it at the Bible. You can't stop it anywhere. Everything starts to fall apart. And yes, it's entirely possible that from our limited point of view, we might think the Bible should be a source of truth, God will be a source of truth, but that's only our limited point of view. Why shouldn't, if you accept that we can't make these judgments, why shouldn't the Bible be completely misleading? Why shouldn't everything we see be completely misleading? Perhaps the world was only created last Wednesday, with all of us placed in it with our present memories. They're really the sceptical theism is so profoundly sceptical that one ceases to have any confidence in anything if you go down that road. And again, that way madness lies, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Well put.
Yeah. Can I quickly talk about the British pet massacre? You might not have heard of this. It happened in 1939, and obviously it was a response to the outbreak of war, and under government duress, 750,000 pets, dogs and cats and things, were slaughtered and burnt. And so you can imagine these sort of dogs talking to each other and saying, well, we do know our owners are loving, so it all must be for the good. It's just that we don't lack full information of why it's for the good. And but actually, when the real reason is revealed, it's nothing to do with the benefit of the pets at all. It's for the benefit of the pet owners, that they'll help survive in the rationing to come and everything. So if you do follow down this road that we don't know what the good is, it doesn't look like it's going to be a good for us. It could well be that we're a means to an end for something else. Okay, so that was just a survey of some of the knock-on impacts you get when you adopt sceptical theism, or the kind of the mystery card approach, or whatever you want to put it. We might come back to that, but we must move on. And now we're going to have, is that in the Bible?
That's really in the Bible.
Okay, and for this episode's Is That in the Bible, we have an interesting verse that absolutely, Ed and Francis, has a lot to do with this sceptical theism. It's used an awful lot. It's used an awful lot in the church an awful lot of times. And I want to actually challenge the being a much more biblical kind of person than a philosophical one. I'm going to give my take on this very, very well-known verse. And it is a very well-known verse. Have you not all heard the verse that goes, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts are not your thoughts." Okay, now that has been so long now and traditionally associated with the inscrutable ways of God that it's just second nature. It's like your mother's milk language. Okay, but I just want to point out, as biblical people who claim to be biblical people, like myself, getting into the text and the context of the text, would like to challenge that, how I think that understanding of the text would actually probably really infuriate the author of Isaiah, whoever that was. And just by pointing out, even just initially, the verses before, okay, well, before I do that, let's have Francis. Francis, when you hear that verse, what do you think?
It does sound as if it's talking about sceptical theism. It does sound as if God is beyond us, and so therefore we cannot question his ways. I'm more familiar with it being referenced rather than directly quoted, where something goes wrong and Christians say, "Oh well, his ways are not our ways." So that obviously is a reference to that actual biblical quotation. So that's what I thought it meant. So I'd be fascinated to find out if it means something different.
Yeah, I'm with Francis, definitely.
Yeah. When you're in the philosophical schools of engagement with apologetics and anywhere in the church with suffering, death, anything, anywhere, you always hear this. Now, let me just point out something here. Okay, it's just like Darwin is quoted sometimes on saying things, and people miss out the passage before and after in the whole context by apologists, you know. This is a similar sort of thing. Now, I just want to put it into the context here. Now, my contention is here with this verse, and you'll get some biblical scholars who argue this, it's that this isn't to do with the inscrutable ways of God. It's to do with the morals of God, and his ways of living that he wants us to live are higher than the way we're living. And if you're called to repentance, you're to be like God and have his thoughts. So it's a bit more like, if you're going to put it in a sort of a lay way, my thoughts are not your thoughts and my thoughts are not your ways, but they jolly well should be. Okay, now that really changes it. Now, look at the verse before. Okay, it's talking about seeking the Lord, not knowing the Lord, or he's inscrutable. It says, "Seek the Lord while he may be found." This is the one verse before it. It goes, "Call on him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake their ways, and the unrighteous their thoughts." Okay, forsake them for what, you may ask? "Let them turn to the Lord, and he will have mercy on them, and to our God, and he will freely pardon." Okay, for my thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. Okay, as the heavens are higher, and we've had the verse. Now, there's two ways that sort of are quite compatible, that is still challenging the philosophical kind of understanding of those verses. And one is that God is actually saying, I'm not like you because I can pardon and I can forgive. It's got nothing to do with not understanding his inscrutable ways. And the other is that my ways for you to live and my thoughts for you to live are way higher than what you're actually doing. So repent, forsake your ways and your thoughts, basically have mine. Now that is much, when I first read that, and I was in a lecture once where somebody talked about that, I was absolutely shocked at how I had always heard that verse, and I had never equated it with the verse before, or even the entire passage of Isaiah where it's talking about God's capacity to forgive. It could be that his capacity to forgive and welcome people back are higher than human capacity not to forgive, that sort of thing. That would be a specific. But if you read that verse, if you ever do this verse again, and I would say to anybody, always read that verse 7 before 8, because it's not saying you can never know the Lord. He can't be understood. Never even try. We're all sceptical theists. For my thoughts are not your thoughts. That's not the verse before it. It's as again, let the wicked forsake their ways, and the unrighteous their thoughts. I sound like a preacher, don't I? And here that's right. But I heard it in this context once. I've never ever forgotten the session I was in where I looked and I went away and actually studied the passage more, and I thought, yeah, this really doesn't fit this use that we have in philosophical arguments. So, can I have either of your thoughts on that?
Well, you convinced me. I think yes, seeing things in context can help, and I think that. I'm now persuaded I've always heard it out of context. You should go back to your
respective partners, and just say, both of your partners would have heard of this verse. It's like so common, isn't it, for the skeptic and non-Christian as well. And you won't get anybody that says what I've just said, but they won't either know the verse before either. Ed, your thoughts?
Yeah, you convinced me, and also it annoys me when the Bible tells me not to think, which is what that other verse is saying. Yes. It says, let the wicked forsake their thoughts, effectively. That's what it's saying. So I think things through with common sense, and God is saying, no, forsake that and just think what I'm telling you to think.
Well, there we go. And that's, so we can use this. And secondly, I've just put another verse down here. Psalm 103:7 says, he made known his ways to Moses, his deeds to the people of God. This is the kind of language of the Old Testament. So this author of Isaiah would be going, what? I wasn't saying God is inscrutable and can't be understood. I was trying to say that you jolly Israelites need to repent and get to act like God. Because I've shown you my ways in his laws.
Which requires him to be...
That's right.
That's right, which requires him to be understood and wholly scrutable, otherwise you can't be like him.
You can't follow his laws. And then later passages in the Bible say, imitate Christ and all the rest of it. Well, I can't. He's inscrutable because your ways are high. And off you go. So, okay, that's my deal for today on Is That in the Bible?
Okay, and now we're going to wrap up with Ed's climate endnote.
Thank you. What I want to talk about this time is there are actually some quite surprising parallels between the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, which was enacted in 1833, and our present situation with the need for some massive policy on climate change. Obviously, the abolition of slavery was a big, big deal, and a big, bold decision was needed to be made to, all the injustice to be driven away. But actually, globally, carbon use is sort of going up and up and up, and despite all the COP21s and everything, a big, bold decision has to be made. Just this sort of nibbling about isn't going to do it. So that's one obvious parallel. And in fact, there were sort of deniers in like climate change deniers. There were people who denied that slavery was genuinely an evil and that the slaves didn't really feel it and all that kind of thing. Another parallel was the kind of hopelessness that came on with 50 years of people campaigning, with giving up sugar and that kind of thing. And it took effort and time, and eventually it happened. And it happened quite suddenly when it did. another one which may not be so obvious. There's a lot of compensation that's needed. There's a lot of oil reserves underground that have been valued. They're valued in pension funds and that kind of thing. And if we were suddenly to say, right, that's it, we're not going to use it, someone is losing a lot of money. And that happened also with the end of slavery. And there was this massive programme of compensation. And the slave estates were given compensation by the government after the abolition of slavery. And then there was a lot of nerve needed to get rid of slavery because of big economies depended on it. So like cotton was obviously a big famous slave crop, and the whole of Lancashire economy was based on processing cotton. So quite a boldness is needed. But they managed it, and firstly with Quakers and then with more evangelical Christians like Wilberforce, it got going. And so this is quite interesting that there's a sort of Christian slant on this. Andrew, I guess you might have something to say on that.
Well, I was going to say that in future podcasts we will definitely pick up on the promise that we gave at the beginning. Where is this promise, they say? Well, that was to talk about the Christian responses to climate change, different Christian responses as well, particularly in the USA. And that will be forthcoming, so watch this Climate End Note for the integration of the sort of things Ed talks about and the Christian responses to the whole topic.
Lovely, thanks. As I said last time, these endnotes are being written up into blogs, so look out for them on the Citizens Climate Lobby UK website.
Okay, well, that wraps up the show for this month. Now, very close to this podcast going out, I'm going to be talking at the Skeptics Unbelievable in the pub group that we run. And then the following podcast will reference that. And I'm going to be talking on the subject of eschatology, particularly the idea of, was Jesus a failed apocalyptic prophet? That will be touched into in next month's episode. So look forward to that and keep listening.
There's feedback options. There's the doubtsallowed@gmail.com website. Find us on Facebook. And then do keep those reviews coming in and ask your questions with the review.
I've been your amazing colossal host, Andrew.
I've been your less impressive host, Francis.
Oh dear, and I'm Ed.
Okay, see you next time.
Right.